Klezmer is the exciting and dynamic genre of music native to the Jews of Eastern Europe. It has an archaic and sometimes esoteric aesthetic, but what gives it this unique sound? Today, you're going to find out. I'm Alek Wasserman, and you're watching Wasserman Music. In today's introduction to Klezmer, the first thing we're going to learn is the Freygish scale, as it's called in Yiddish. This scale, which goes by several different names, including Phrygian dominant, can be found in the music of various cultures, both Western and Eastern. The Freygish scale's most defining feature is the augmented second interval between its second and third scale degrees, which sounds like this. The augmented second is enharmonically equivalent, meaning that it sounds the same, to a minor third, but we will call it an augmented second because we're working with two consecutive notes within a scale which happen to be 3 half steps apart. For today's video, we'll be looking at the Freygish scale starting on A, but you can use any note as your starting pitch so long as you maintain the same intervallic structure from note to note. Let's take a listen. There are effectively two ways to relate the Freygish scale back to more commonly used minor scales. The first is to think of it as a harmonic minor scale that starts and ends on the 5th scale degree. Notice how the D harmonic minor scale uses the same pitches as A Freygish, but it starts in a different place. The second relationship is to say that the Freygish scale is like a natural minor scale with a flat second and a sharp third. The A natural minor scale starts in the same place as A Freygish, but uses B natural and C natural rather than B flat and C sharp, respectively. Alright, now that we've learned the scale, we need to know how to harmonize it. I'm mainly going to go through triads that are native to the Freygish scale, but I will say that it is not impossible to use 7th chords and chords that are not native to the scale. But those chords would certainly be much more rare. As you can see with all the chords together, the placement of the augmented second between the 2nd and 3rd scale degrees creates some interesting chord qualities. The 1 chord is a major chord and is relatively easy to work with and functions just like a 1 chord in many other scales. It sounds like this. The flat 2 chord is where things get interesting. In classical music, we would call this a Neapolitan chord, and we'd reserve it for special situations as a predominant chord. This means the Neapolitan would go directly to a 5 chord as a sort of way of adding some extra color to a cadence. In Klezmer music, however, because of the prominence of the flat 2 in the 2nd scale degree, the flat 2 major chord takes on what I would argue is essentially a dominant function, and it sounds like this. Here's an example of a flat 2 major chord in a dominant function from a piece of music that I wrote. The sharp 3 diminished chord is a bit of a weird one. First of all, 3 chords are relatively rare in most music, even when they have a major or minor chord quality. And diminished chords typically have a predominant or dominant function, which isn't the case here. I'm not going to say that the sharp 3 diminished is impossible to use, but it certainly wouldn't be as common. Here's what it sounds like. The 4 chord is pretty straightforward. It's just a minor chord with a predominant function. The only thing that's funky about it is that it exists here in a scale that has a major 1 chord, but when you think about it, that's really akin to any Bach piece that ends on a Picardy third. Here's the 4 chord. The 5 diminished chord maintains the dominant function that is characteristic of any 5 chord. The difference is now we're working with a diminished chord. When you think about it, that's really not very different from using a 7 diminished chord as a dominant function in classical music. The 5 chord sounds like this. And here's an example of the 5 diminished chord from the same piece of music as before. Only I've added a 7th to make it a 5 half diminished 7th chord. The augmented 6th chord is not at all common in this style. Augmented chords have a special color to them that is honestly difficult to work into a chord progression without having it sound like kind of a special effect. See what I mean? And finally, that brings us to our minor 7 chord, which renders a weaker dominant effect. Being only 1 pitch away from the aforementioned 5 half diminished 7th chord, the 7 chord functions very similarly.
5 half diminished 7th chord. Minor 7 chord.
All right, now you're ready to get started on your first piece of klezmer music. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and share. Until next time, shalom.